The perfectly balanced video game does not exist. Okay, well, maybe it does. I just wanted something dramatic to start this video off with. Because, in all seriousness, from my experience having played a lot of video games, there isn't one game that is perfectly balanced. At least not one that I've come across. There are many video games that have come super close, but balancing a video game in its entirety, making sure that every component has the perfect amount of give and take in comparison to one another, is an overwhelming and difficult task. Especially as a game grows in size, it increases in that number of components it has, and therefore it just increases in complexity. One aspect that most people are familiar with, and that's present in almost every game, is finding that balance for the difficulty level. If it's too easy, a player will not have any enjoyment in beating it. But if the difficulty is too high, the player may have some frustration and will also not enjoy it. And this is just one of the many components game developers have to keep in mind. There are other aspects like weapon scaling, leveling, PvP, level design, and so on. But today, we will be focusing on the balancing of encounters and items. There is an important line that game developers reference when deciding how to disperse their content. Content meaning encounters and items. So let's take a look at a common way that this line can be visualized. On the far left side of this line, we have encounters or items that the video game designers definitely intended and hope for you to come across. Sometimes even, if it's a little too far to the left of this line, an encounter can feel like the game took your hand and dragged you there against your will. In the middle would be the average, and on the far right, there are encounters and items that the game designers had little to no intention of players to come across. It's important to note that some games do not really have anything that would fall into this right category. For example, in a simple game like Pac-Man, everything was designed with the intention for the player to definitely come across. Whereas in some other games, like Super Mario Bros., it even has some content that's tucked away, hidden in those little tubes that not every player will experience. Another way to go about illustrating this would be by using the percentages of the total players that would come across the item or encounter. For example, the far right side would be representing an encounter or item that only 5% of the player base would come across. The middle, or the average, would be something that 50% of the players would come across. And then on the far left, we would have items and encounters that 100% of players would come across. Okay, maybe just 99%, there's always that one guy. So let's say, for example, there's an item that is super powerful and has some special magical abilities that can increase a player's damage. Ideally, game developers wouldn't want every player in the game to have that item. 1, because then it wouldn't be as special and rare anymore, and 2, because the designers want to reward those players who might have invested extra time into the game to unlock that item or encounter. The second reason is arguably the more important reason, because for that dedicated player base, having rewards of secret endings, extra encounters, or additional items allows them to know that the game developers appreciate and repay that level of dedication to their game. Without it, players have less of an incentive to spend all that extra time. But on the other hand, if the game designers have a main story point in which missing it would lead to being confused, the designers are going to do their best to put that encounter on the far left side of this line. An example of this is how maybe a cutscene will start playing once a player enters into an area to help prevent the chance that a player would miss it. When everything is placed appropriately on this line, players shouldn't be aware that it's even happening. It feels natural and fair. However, when an item or encounter is misplaced, it sticks out. One example of this misplacement occurring happens in Elden Ring with the intended tutorial area. The tutorial area, which naturally should be an encounter that lies somewhere on the left side of this line, went missed by a large majority of players. As a result, many players entirely skipped the introduction to Elden Ring's gameplay mechanics. This misplacement of this encounter stood out, and once enough of a conversation got going around it, it was memed to hell for it. And on top of that, FromSoft even patched in a screen that pops up to tell players in a very obvious way that down that hole is the tutorial, leaning this interaction previously from the right side to the left side of the scale. The discussion of what would make a game well-balanced is ongoing, and there are constant disagreements. Other factors like pay to win or players having different ranges of skill makes balancing a game more complicated than it might appear on the surface. Because even when game developers are using this line and placing the encounters and items in the best way they can, there will always be people who disagree. And that's honestly one of the aspects I like about playing video games. The fact that there's this community of people who enjoy games so much that They just want to talk about it. So maybe next time you're booting up one of your favorite games, you take a second to think about how its content is balanced. Maybe you'll notice some small details you didn't notice before. But in the meantime, is there a perfectly balanced game?
I'm a OP boy. Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my seat, boy. Know that they ride or die.